October 13th, 1847, Ravenshollow Plantation. The screams from Ravenshollow Plantation could be heard for miles across the Louisiana bayou. By dawn, nothing remained but smoldering ash and the charred bones of 7 souls who thought they were untouchable. The bride wore white that evening, but she left wearing the crimson of vengeance. What you're about to discover will forever change how you see the carefully sanitized stories of the antebellum South. This isn't just another tale of plantation cruelty. This is the story of a systematic breeding program disguised as marriage, where enslaved women were forced into wedding gowns to legitimize the rape that followed. The horror wasn't hidden in the shadows of southern mansions. It was celebrated in parlors, blessed by ministers, and toasted with champagne. Tonight, you'll learn how one woman turned their own twisted ceremony into their funeral pyre. But I warn you, some truths burn hotter than fire. Welcome to Echoes of Truth, where we gather the bravest souls who dare to uncover history's darkest secrets buried beneath layers of romantic mythology. If you think you can handle the real story behind the antebellum wedding that became a massacre, hit that subscribe button now. Comment your location below, because tonight, you're joining an investigation that will reveal how deep the conspiracy of silence really goes. Do you have the courage to hear what really happened in the shadows of Southern hospitality? Meet Cornelius Blackwood, the 52-year-old master of Ravenshollow Plantation, a man whose Sunday morning church attendance was matched only by his Saturday night depravity. To his fellow plantation owners, he was a pillar of Southern society, a war veteran, a successful businessman, a generous contributor to the local Baptist church. His neighbors saw a distinguished gentleman with silver hair and kind eyes who spoke eloquently about Christian values and the divine order of society. But I want you to picture this man as his enslaved workers saw him, a predator who had perfected the art of legitimizing sexual violence through mock ceremonies. Blackwood had discovered that by staging wedding ceremonies between himself and enslaved women, he could maintain the veneer of respectability while systematically raping them. His overseer, a skeletal man named Jonas Cray, served as both witness and enforcer of these grotesque unions. Cray had dead eyes that seemed to look right through human flesh and hands that bore the scars of decades of violence. Together, they had transformed Ravenshollow into something that would make the devils themselves recoil in horror. The plantation's account books, later discovered in the ruins, revealed the true scope of their operation. 17 marriages in 5 years, with meticulous records of the children produced and their eventual sale. This wasn't passion or even mere cruelty. This was industrial-scale sexual slavery, with a wedding dress draped over it. To the outside world, Cornelius Blackwood was simply a kind master who believed in the sanctity of Christian marriage, even for his slaves. Local newspapers praised his progressive approach to plantation management, writing glowing articles about how he encouraged stable family units among his workforce. The cover story was masterfully crafted. Blackwood claimed he was following biblical principles by ensuring that his enslaved workers entered into proper unions blessed by God. He invited local ministers to perform the ceremonies, neighbors to witness the festivities, and even hired photographers to document what he called civilized plantation life. The wedding announcements appeared in parish newspapers, complete with descriptions of the bride's dress and the elegant reception that followed. Visitors to Ravenshollow spoke admiringly of how Blackwood's slaves seemed so well behaved, so content, so properly Christian in their demeanor. What those visitors didn't understand was that they were witnessing trauma responses, not contentment. The enslaved workers had learned to perform happiness because the alternative was death. Blackwood even published a pamphlet titled Christian Stewardship in the New South, which became required reading in seminary schools across Louisiana. In it, he argued that masters had a moral obligation to provide the civilizing influence of marriage to their enslaved population. This document, which survived the fire, reveals the calculated nature of his deception. Every word chosen to make sexual slavery sound like missionary work. Now, let's be real. What Blackwood had created at Ravenshollow was nothing short of a rape factory disguised as a Christian plantation. The mansion's third floor had been converted into what Blackwood euphemistically called bridal suites, but these were actually holding cells where newly married women were imprisoned until they produced children. The windows were barred from the outside and painted over to prevent anyone from seeing in or out. A narrow staircase, hidden behind what appeared to be a bookshelf in Blackwood's study, provided discreet access to these chambers without having to use the main household stairs. The rooms themselves were designed to muffle sound, with thick carpets and heavy drapery that absorbed screams. Each suite contained a bed, a wash basin, and a single chair, nothing more. The doors locked from the outside only, and meals were delivered through a slot barely large enough for a food tray. Blackwood had even installed a system of speaking tubes that allowed him to communicate with the imprisoned women without having to see them face to face. A detail that reveals just how thoroughly he had mechanized sexual violence. The plantation's medical records, kept by a complicit doctor named Silas Morrow, documented forced examinations to confirm pregnancies and track the productivity of each union. Dr. Morrow's journal, later found in the ashes, contained clinical notes about breeding success rates and recommendations for improving fertility outcomes. This infrastructure of horror had been operating for 5 years before anyone dared to challenge it. When neighboring planters occasionally questioned why Blackwood's female slaves seemed so withdrawn and fearful, the official explanations were always ready and reasonable sounding. Blackwood claimed that new brides were naturally shy and needed time to adjust to married life, hence their seclusion. When asked why these women never seemed to appear at community gatherings or church services, he explained that they were receiving Christian instruction to prepare them for their roles as wives and mothers. The locked third floor. That was simply where the delicate ladies rested during their delicate conditions. Pregnancy being a time when enslaved women needed protection from the harsh realities of plantation work. The screams that occasionally echoed from the mansion. Those were simply the sounds of childbirth, which everyone knew could be quite dramatic among that population. Local authorities were told that Blackwood was conducting a grand social experiment in improving the moral character of enslaved people through proper Christian marriage, an explanation that appealed to their sense of racial superiority and religious duty. When Dr. Morrow was asked about his frequent visits to Ravenshollow, he claimed he was conducting research on the medical differences between enslaved and free populations, work that he insisted was vital to advancing Southern medicine. Even the specially constructed staircase and speaking tubes were explained away as accommodations for Blackwood's rheumatism, which supposedly made it difficult for him to climb regular stairs or speak in normal tones. Every sinister detail had been wrapped in a bow of respectability, creating a fortress of plausible deniability that protected the operation for half a decade. The key enabler in this house of horrors was a woman you'd never suspect, Evangeline Dubois, a 45-year-old free woman of color who served as Blackwood's head housekeeper and, more importantly, as his procurer of victims. Evangeline had convinced herself that she was protecting enslaved women by helping to select those who would become Blackwood's brides, choosing girls she believed were strong enough to survive the ordeal. In her twisted logic, becoming one of Blackwood's wives was preferable to the alternatives available to enslaved women. At least they wouldn't be sold away from Louisiana, and their children would remain on the plantation. Evangeline maintained detailed records of each woman's menstrual cycle, temperament, and physical characteristics, information she passed along to help Blackwood make his selections. She personally prepared each bride for her wedding night, braiding their hair with white ribbons, applying rouge to their cheeks, and whispering what she believed were words of comfort. Just close your eyes and think of somewhere else. It will be over soon. What made Evangeline's collaboration so chilling was her genuine belief that she was showing mercy. She had convinced herself that by participating in this system, she was somehow minimizing the harm done to her fellow women of color. Her diary, discovered in the ruins of her cabin, reveals the profound psychological gymnastics she performed to live with herself. Master Blackwood is kinder than most. At least he calls them wives. At least he keeps them fed and housed. At least their babies will know their father's name. Evangeline's complicity demonstrates how systems of oppression corrupt even their victims, forcing them to become agents of their own destruction in the name of survival. The women selected as Blackwood's brides shared certain characteristics that made them particularly vulnerable. They were young, isolated, and possessed of a beauty that had already marked them for unwanted attention. Most were between the ages of 16 and 22, recently purchased from other plantations or inherited from deceased relatives, meaning they had no established community connections that might complicate their disappearance into the third-floor chambers. Take Celeste Moreau, a 19-year-old Creole woman who had been trained as a seamstress before being sold to Blackwood. Her skilled hands, which had once created beautiful garments, were now relegated to mending the very wedding dress she'd been forced to wear. There was Marie-Claire Thibodeau, barely 18, who spoke 3 languages and could read Latin, accomplishments that meant nothing once she became wife number 12 in Blackwood's collection. These women possessed intelligence, talent, and dreams that extended far beyond the plantation's borders, which made their psychological destruction even more complete. They understood exactly what was being done to them, could see the full scope of their captivity, and knew that their education and abilities were being deliberately wasted as a form of additional punishment. The youngest bride, a girl named Rosalie, who claimed to be 16 but looked younger, had arrived at Ravenshollow just 3 days before her wedding. Sold by a Virginia planter who needed quick cash to pay gambling debts, she still wore the bruises from her journey south, dark marks on her wrists and ankles that the white lace couldn't quite conceal. Each of these women had a story, a family, hopes for freedom that had been systematically crushed beneath the weight of Blackwood's perverted system. This is where the story gets truly chilling, because the witness who would ultimately bring down Blackwood's operation was his own nephew, Thomas Blackwood, a 23-year-old seminary student visiting from Virginia for the cotton harvest. Thomas had arrived at Ravenshollow expecting to spend a month studying scripture and preparing for his future ministry among the enslaved population. What he discovered instead would shatter his faith in both his family and his God. On his 3rd night at the plantation, Thomas was awakened by sounds from above his bedroom, rhythmic thumping against the floor, followed by what he initially mistook for singing. Curious about what he assumed was late-night celebration, he began investigating the source of the sounds. Using a servant's staircase he'd discovered as a child, Thomas climbed to the 3rd floor, where he found a hallway lined with locked doors. The singing, he realized with growing horror, was actually sobbing, the muffled cries of women in unimaginable distress. Through a gap in one of the doors, Thomas glimpsed a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his short life. A young woman, still wearing the remnants of a torn wedding dress, chained to a bed in a room that reeked of fear and desperation. When he tried to confront his uncle the next morning, Blackwood calmly explained that Thomas had witnessed the private marriage chambers where his brides rested during their adjustment period. The casual way his uncle discussed systematic rape as if it were livestock management convinced Thomas that he was living in a house of demons wearing human faces. But Thomas was trapped. Who would believe such accusations against a pillar of the community? And more terrifyingly, what would happen to him if he tried to leave with this knowledge? Thomas Blackwood's attempts to process what he'd witnessed resulted in a complete psychological breakdown that his uncle carefully managed as a crisis of faith common among young seminary students. Within days of his discovery, Thomas began experiencing violent nightmares, uncontrollable trembling, and an inability to eat or sleep. When he tried to confide in the plantation's visiting minister about the spiritual darkness he'd encountered, Reverend Marcus Whitfield dismissed his concerns as the result of too much theological study and recommended prayer and rest. Thomas wrote frantic letters to his professors at seminary, describing in veiled terms the satanic practices disguised as Christian marriage he'd observed, but his instructors interpreted these as metaphorical descriptions of his struggle with the moral complexities of slavery. His own parents, when they received word of their son's nervous condition, attributed it to the notorious Louisiana climate and its effects on delicate northern constitutions. Meanwhile, Cornelius Blackwood had begun dosing his nephew's evening brandy with laudanum, ensuring that Thomas's increasingly desperate attempts to expose the truth would be dismissed as the ravings of an opium addict. Dr. Morrow, the plantation's complicit physician, diagnosed Thomas with acute melancholia brought on by excessive religious contemplation and prescribed complete isolation and rest, effectively placing him under house arrest in his own bedroom. Thomas's journal from this period, later found hidden in his mattress, reveals a young man frantically trying to maintain his sanity while surrounded by people determined to convince him that what he'd seen was either imaginary or perfectly normal. "They speak of marriage as if it were not rape," he wrote in increasingly shaky handwriting. "They discuss these women as if they were breeding cattle, and when I object, they quote scripture to justify their evil." When Thomas finally managed to send an uncensored letter to Louisiana's Episcopal bishop describing the ungodly practices at Ravenshollow, church officials were forced to conduct what they called a pastoral investigation of the allegations. Bishop Augustine Rousseau arrived at the plantation with 2 associate ministers, ostensibly to examine claims of irregular marriage practices among the enslaved population. But this investigation was designed from the start to protect Blackwood rather than uncover the truth. Cornelius had been given 2 weeks' notice of the visit, enough time to relocate his most recent brides to a cabin deep in the swamp and to coach his remaining enslaved workers on what to say. The investigating ministers were shown carefully selected areas of the plantation, introduced to seemingly happy enslaved couples with young children, and treated to elaborate dinners that showcased Blackwood's hospitality and Christian generosity. When they asked to interview Thomas, they found a young man so heavily sedated with laudanum that he could barely form coherent sentences, let alone substantiate his earlier claims. Dr. Morrow presented the bishops with medical records documenting Thomas's progressive mental deterioration and recommended that his testimony be disregarded as the product of a diseased mind. The official report, filed with both church and civil authorities, praised Blackwood's innovative approach to Christian stewardship and recommended his methods as a model for other planters. Bishop Rousseau wrote that he had found no evidence of improper conduct, but rather a Christian gentleman working tirelessly to bring the light of proper marriage to those living in darkness. The investigation's conclusions were published in the Louisiana Church Gazette, effectively immunizing Blackwood against future accusations by establishing an official record of his innocence. Now you have to understand, the most damning evidence of Blackwood's crimes walked around Ravenshollow Plantation every day, but everyone had been trained not to see it. The women who had survived their time as Blackwood's brides bore unmistakable signs of prolonged trauma that anyone with eyes should have recognized. They moved through their daily tasks with the mechanical precision of broken automatons, their eyes vacant and unfocused, their voices reduced to whispers even when giving simple responses to direct questions. Marie-Claire Thibodeau, once fluent in 3 languages, had been reduced to communicating only in nods and headshakes, as if speech itself had become too dangerous. Celeste Moreau's skillful seamstress hands now shook uncontrollably, making fine needlework impossible and relegating her to the coarsest plantation tasks. These women flinched at sudden movements, cowered when men approached, and displayed the hollow-eyed stare that we now recognize as the 1,000-yard stare of severe trauma victims. Their children, too, bore the marks of the system that had created them, unusually quiet, hyper-vigilant, and displaying premature awareness of adult dangers that no child should understand. But the most chilling evidence was how these traumatized women had been scattered throughout the plantation's workforce, integrated into the daily routine, as if their condition was perfectly normal. Visitors to Ravenshollow were told that these women suffered from melancholia, a condition that Blackwood claimed was common among enslaved females and was best treated with steady work and Christian guidance. The casual acceptance of their obvious trauma reveals how completely the plantation community had been conditioned to ignore evidence of systematic abuse. When human suffering becomes so normalized that it's invisible, you're looking at a society that has lost its soul. What made Blackwood's operation particularly horrific was its calculated, almost scientific approach to maximizing both sexual violence and reproductive output. Documents found in his study after the fire revealed a system of record-keeping that would have impressed any industrial manager. Detailed charts tracking each woman's menstrual cycles, fertility periods, and pregnancy outcomes. Blackwood had developed what he called his rotation system, designed to ensure continuous access to victims while maintaining the appearance of monogamous Christian marriage. Each bride was subjected to a precise timeline: wedding night, 30-day honeymoon period of nightly rape, pregnancy confirmation, and then relegation to general plantation work while the next victim was selected. Dr. Morrow's medical notes reveal that Blackwood had even experimented with different dietary regimens to improve fertility rates, treating these women like prize breeding stock. The most disturbing discovery was Blackwood's correspondence with other plantation owners, in which he shared his methodologies and offered consultation services to help them establish similar operations. Letters from planters in Mississippi, Alabama, and South Carolina thanked him for his innovative approaches to labor management and requested detailed instructions for constructing their own bridal facilities. This wasn't the isolated depravity of a single monster. It was a networked system of institutionalized sexual slavery with its own best practices, peer review, and continuous improvement processes. Blackwood had even begun drafting a manual titled Christian Marriage as a Tool of Plantation Management, which he planned to publish through a religious press in Charleston. The introduction to this unpublished manuscript reveals the depth of his delusion. Through proper Christian marriage, the master can transform base animal impulses into sanctified family structures that serve both God and the economic needs of Christian civilization. Enter Delphine Marigny, a 22-year-old Creole woman who had been purchased by Blackwood just 6 weeks before the fire, but who possessed something that none of his previous victims had: a network of free relatives in New Orleans who were actively searching for her. Delphine had been born free but kidnapped from her grandmother's house and sold into slavery by corrupt officials who falsified her papers. Unlike the other women selected as Blackwood's brides, Delphine had grown up with freedom, education, and the unshakable belief that she was the equal of any white person. Her father had been a successful carpenter who owned his own shop. Her mother was a seamstress who counted wealthy white women among her clientele. Delphine herself had been trained in both trades and could read, write, and calculate numbers with the skill of any educated person in Louisiana. But what made her truly dangerous to Blackwood's system was her refusal to accept that her current situation was permanent. While other enslaved women had been broken by years of conditioning, Delphine still possessed the psychological framework of a free person. She saw slavery as an illegal imprisonment rather than her natural condition. Her first act upon arriving at Ravenshollow was to memorize every detail of the plantation's layout, catalog every person's daily routines, and begin planning her escape. When she learned that she had been selected as Blackwood's next bride, Delphine didn't despair. She saw an opportunity to get close enough to her captor to destroy him completely. The other enslaved workers initially viewed her confidence as dangerous delusion, but Delphine's unshakable certainty that she would be free again began to kindle hope in hearts that had forgotten what freedom felt like. Delphine's investigation into Blackwood's operation began the moment she realized what fate awaited her as his chosen bride. Unlike previous victims who had been isolated and powerless, Delphine used her status as the master's intended wife to move freely through areas of the plantation that were normally off-limits to enslaved workers. She befriended Evangeline Dubois, the complicit housekeeper, by appealing to her sense of maternal protection, convincing the older woman that she was terrified and needed guidance to survive her upcoming ordeal. Through careful questioning disguised as innocent anxiety, Delphine learned the locations of the hidden staircase, the third-floor chambers, and most importantly, the schedule of Dr. Morrow's visits. She discovered that Blackwood kept his most incriminating documents in a locked desk drawer in his study, and that he maintained correspondence with other planters involved in similar operations. Delphine also cultivated relationships with the enslaved men who worked as house servants, learning from them that Thomas Blackwood had been drugged into submission and was being held prisoner in his own bedroom. Most crucially, she identified the plantation's vulnerabilities: the mansion's wooden construction, the isolated location that would delay any fire response, and the fact that Blackwood's wedding nights followed a predictable pattern that would leave him intoxicated and vulnerable. Delphine spent her days playing the role of a frightened, compliant bride-to-be while secretly gathering lamp oil, candles, and other flammable materials. She studied the wind patterns around the mansion, noting that the prevailing breeze from the river would carry flames from the main house to the overseer's quarters and the other plantation buildings. Every smile, every courteous "yes, master," every gesture of submission was calculated to lower Blackwood's guard, while she prepared to burn his entire world to the ground. I need to stop you right here, because what comes next is going to challenge everything you thought you knew about resistance, justice, and the true cost of freedom. Can you handle what comes next? Because this is where the story turns truly chilling. Not because of what was done to Delphine, but because of what she was willing to do in return. We're about to witness a level of calculated vengeance that will make you question whether justice and revenge are really different things, or if they're just the same force viewed from different angles. Before we continue down this path of fire and retribution, I need you to ask yourself, how far would you go to stop a monster? How much of your own humanity would you sacrifice to save others from unspeakable evil? If you think you're ready to face those questions, hit that like button now and let me know in the comments. Because Delphine Marini is about to show us what happens when someone refuses to be a victim, even if it means becoming something else entirely. The next part of this story will burn itself into your memory, and once you hear it, you'll never be able to forget the price that freedom sometimes demands. Are you sure you want to know what really happened on that October night when the screams echoed across the bayou? 3 days before her scheduled wedding, Delphine made the discovery that transformed her from an escape-minded prisoner into an avenging angel. While cleaning Blackwood's study under Evangeline's supervision, she managed to pick the lock on his desk drawer and found the correspondence that revealed the true scope of his operation. Letters from plantation owners across the South detailed their own attempts to replicate Blackwood's breeding program, complete with architectural drawings for hidden chambers and medical advice for maximizing fertility. But the most damning evidence was Blackwood's personal ledger, which recorded not just the names and ages of his victims, but their ultimate fates. Marie Claire expired during 4th confinement, October 1846. Child survived, sold to Antebellum Plantation for $400. Rosalie, unsuitable for breeding, transferred to fieldwork, deceased January 1847. These weren't just records of sexual slavery. They were death certificates for women who had been murdered by systematic rape and forced pregnancy. Delphine realized she was holding evidence of at least 12 deaths, with more planned for the future. The correspondence also revealed that Thomas Blackwood wasn't just suffering from melancholia. He was being slowly poisoned to prevent him from exposing his uncle's crimes. Dr. Morrow's letters to Cornelius discussed adjusting the dosage to ensure permanent mental incapacity without arousing suspicion. As Delphine read these clinical discussions of murder and sexual slavery, she felt something cold and final settle in her chest. This wasn't just about her own survival anymore. She was the only person in a position to stop a killing machine that had been operating for years and was planning to expand across the entire South. The evidence she held could save dozens of future victims, but only if she could survive long enough to act on it. On the morning of October 13, 1847, Delphine's careful planning nearly unraveled when Evangeline discovered her hiding lamp oil in her wedding dress. The confrontation that followed revealed the full depth of the older woman's psychological imprisonment. Even when faced with evidence of the murders she had helped facilitate, Evangeline couldn't accept that her cooperation had made her complicit in systematic killing. "You don't understand," she pleaded with Delphine. "Master Blackwood gives these women a better life than they'd have anywhere else. At least here, they're fed, clothed, treated with Christian kindness." When Delphine showed her the ledger entries recording the deaths of previous brides, Evangeline's response was to immediately report the conversation to Blackwood, believing she was protecting both the plantation's operations and Delphine herself from the consequences of rebellious thinking. Blackwood's reaction was swift and decisive. He ordered Jonas Cray to secure Delphine in the third-floor chamber immediately, foregoing the planned wedding ceremony in favor of immediate imprisonment. But Delphine had anticipated betrayal and had already distributed her collected lamp oil and candles throughout the mansion's wooden framework. As Cray dragged her toward the hidden staircase, she managed to light the first fire in Blackwood's study, using the very documents she'd discovered as kindling. The flames spread faster than anyone could have imagined, fed by the oil she'd systematically soaked into curtains, carpets, and wooden beams over the previous week. Within minutes, the mansion was consumed by a blaze that could be seen from the river, and what had begun as Delphine's capture became a desperate fight for survival as the entire plantation's power structure literally went up in smoke around them. As Ravenshollow Plantation burned behind her, Delphine had expected to find justice and protection when she reached the neighboring plantation of Magnolia Grove. But what she encountered instead was a conspiracy of silence that extended far beyond Blackwood's property lines. The neighboring planters, rather than celebrating the destruction of a criminal operation, immediately began crafting a narrative that would protect the reputation of the entire district. They claimed that Delphine was a deranged arsonist who had murdered innocent people in their beds, transforming her from a victim who had defended herself into a dangerous criminal who threatened the safety of every plantation family in Louisiana. The local sheriff, who arrived at dawn to survey the ruins, found 7 charred bodies in the mansion's remains: Cornelius Blackwood, Jonas Cray, Dr. Morrow, Evangeline Dubois, and 3 house servants who had been trapped by the flames. But instead of investigating the evidence of sexual slavery that Delphine tried to show him, Sheriff Claude Boudreau focused entirely on the fact that an enslaved woman had killed white people, regardless of the circumstances that had driven her to such desperate action. The ledger and correspondence that Delphine had preserved as evidence were dismissed as forgeries she had created to justify her crimes. Even more chilling was the discovery that Sheriff Boudreau had been receiving payments from Blackwood for years to ignore reports of missing enslaved women and to discourage any investigations into the plantation's unusual practices. Thomas Blackwood, the only potential witness who could corroborate Delphine's account, was found barely alive, but so damaged by months of poisoning that his testimony was dismissed as the ravings of a madman. The same system that had protected Blackwood's operation while it was running now closed ranks to protect the reputation of those who had enabled it, leaving Delphine to face charges of multiple murder with no one willing to speak in her defense. When Louisiana state authorities finally conducted a thorough investigation of the Ravenshollow ruins 2 weeks after the fire, what they discovered in the third-floor chambers confirmed every horrific detail of Delphine's testimony. But by then, the political decision had already been made to suppress the evidence rather than expose the systematic crimes that had been operating with official approval. The investigators found chains still bolted to bed frames, barred windows that had been painted over to prevent anyone from seeing inside, and a collection of personal items that could only have belonged to the missing women whose families had been searching for them for years. Hidden behind a false wall in Blackwood's study, they discovered a second set of ledgers that documented not just his own operation, but a network of similar facilities across Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. These records contained the names of prominent planters, government officials, and even church leaders who had either participated in or profited from the systematic sexual slavery of enslaved women. Dr. Morrow's medical journals revealed detailed documentation of forced sterilizations, experimental procedures conducted without anesthesia, and clinical observations about the psychological effects of prolonged sexual torture. Most damning of all was the correspondence between Blackwood and officials in the Louisiana legislature discussing proposed laws that would have legalized his breeding program as a form of scientific plantation management. The physical evidence also included architectural plans for expanding the third-floor chambers and correspondence with builders in other states who had been contracted to construct similar facilities. But rather than using this evidence to expose the broader conspiracy, state officials classified the entire investigation as confidential and ordered all physical evidence to be destroyed. The official report claimed that the fire had been caused by a disgruntled enslaved worker and made no mention of the systematic crimes that had been uncovered in the ruins. Let's be real about who Cornelius Blackwood really was, because the truth is even more disturbing than the crimes he committed at Ravenshollow. Investigation into his background revealed that he wasn't just a plantation owner who had descended into depravity. He was a former military officer who had developed his techniques for psychological torture during his service in the Seminole Wars, where he had been court-martialed for excessive cruelty toward captured enemies, but had escaped prosecution through political connections. Blackwood had been experimenting with methods of breaking human resistance since the 1820s, and his marriage scheme was simply the latest evolution of tactics he had been refining for decades. His personal papers, recovered from a fireproof safe in the mansion's basement, included detailed psychological profiles of each victim and clinical notes about which methods of intimidation proved most effective for different personality types. Dr. Silas Morrow's true identity was equally shocking. He wasn't a legitimate physician at all, but a former military surgeon who had been discharged for conducting unauthorized medical experiments on soldiers under his care. His real name was Wilhelm Kruger, a German immigrant who had fled Europe after being accused of grave robbing and human experimentation. The medical procedures he had performed on Blackwood's victims weren't just cruel. They were part of a systematic study of human reproduction that he planned to publish in European medical journals. Jonas Cray, the skeletal overseer, proved to be a convicted murderer from Georgia who had been hired specifically because his own history of violence made him a perfect enforcer for Blackwood's operations. Even Evangeline Dubois had a hidden past. She had been one of Blackwood's earliest victims, but rather than being discarded like the others, she had been psychologically conditioned to become his willing accomplice through years of calculated manipulation that had completely shattered her moral compass. Now you have to understand, what burned down at Ravenshollow wasn't just one plantation's house of horrors. It was the headquarters of an international trafficking network that stretched from the sugar plantations of Louisiana to the cotton fields of Alabama, and even across the Atlantic to British colonial operations in the Caribbean. The correspondence found in Blackwood's fireproof safe revealed connections to European investors who were funding similar breeding programs as part of what they called scientific approaches to labor optimization. Letters from London banking houses discussed investment opportunities in human capital development projects with projected returns based on the productive capacity of enslaved women over their reproductive lifespans. French plantation owners in Haiti had been consulting with Blackwood about adapting his methods to their own operations, while Spanish colonial administrators in Cuba were requesting detailed architectural plans for constructing discrete residential facilities for their most valuable enslaved females. The network even included northern industrialists who were investing in southern plantation operations specifically because of their innovative approaches to workforce development. Ship manifests discovered in New Orleans revealed that young women were being transported between plantations across state lines as part of an organized breeding exchange program, with detailed records of their fertility histories and genetic characteristics. Dr. Morrow's real identity as Wilhelm Kruger connected the operation to European medical institutions that were funding his research into human reproduction and racial characteristics. This wasn't just American slavery. It was an international system of industrialized sexual violence that treated human beings as breeding stock for a global economy built on forced labor and systematic rape. The most chilling aspect of the Ravenshollow investigation wasn't what it revealed about the crimes themselves, but how completely Southern society closed ranks to protect the reputation of everyone who had enabled those crimes. Local newspapers refused to report on the evidence of systematic sexual slavery, instead publishing stories about tragic plantation fire caused by rebellious slave. Church leaders who had blessed Blackwood's mock weddings claimed they had been deceived about the true nature of the ceremonies, while simultaneously arguing that whatever had happened was justified by the need to maintain order among the enslaved population. Government officials who had received bribes to ignore missing women reports suddenly developed convenient amnesia about their past interactions with Blackwood. The Louisiana legislature even passed a special resolution praising Blackwood posthumously for his contributions to plantation management and Christian stewardship, effectively canonizing a serial rapist and murderer as a martyr to Southern values. Federal authorities, when presented with evidence of the interstate trafficking network, declined to investigate on the grounds that it would interfere with states' rights and property relations. Medical journals refused to publish exposés of Dr. Morrow's experimental procedures, claiming that such revelations would damage the reputation of Southern medicine and discourage legitimate research. Even abolitionists in the North, when provided with documentation of the breeding program, chose not to publicize it because they feared the graphic details would be too shocking for their audiences and might actually generate sympathy for the moderate approach to slavery they were trying to reform. The conspiracy of silence extended to the victims' own families. Free relatives of kidnapped women like Delphine were told that pursuing justice would only result in their own enslavement, or worse. An entire society had decided that preserving its comfortable illusions was more important than acknowledging the systematic torture of human beings. Delphine Marigny's fate reveals everything you need to know about justice in the antebellum South. She was tried for multiple murder in a courthouse where the judge owned 3 plantations, the prosecutor had business dealings with Blackwood's associates, and the defense attorney was appointed by the same court that had already decided her guilt. Despite overwhelming evidence that she had been defending herself against systematic rape and murder, Delphine was convicted after a trial that lasted exactly 4 hours and included no testimony about the conditions that had driven her to violence. She was sentenced to death by hanging, but the execution was delayed when abolitionists in the North began publicizing her case as an example of Southern injustice. During the 6 months she spent in New Orleans Parish Prison, Delphine became an international symbol of resistance against slavery, with her story appearing in newspapers from Boston to London. But even this attention couldn't save her. She was found dead in her cell on the morning of her scheduled execution, officially from natural causes, but clearly murdered to prevent her from becoming a martyr whose execution might galvanize anti-slavery sentiment. Thomas Blackwood, the seminary student whose testimony might have supported Delphine's account, never recovered from the psychological damage of his poisoning and spent the rest of his short life in a private asylum, where he died in 1849, still muttering about wedding bells that ring for the dead. The other enslaved workers from Ravenshollow were sold at auction to plantations across the South, their testimonies about what they had witnessed dismissed as the unreliable accounts of inferior beings. Sheriff Boudreaux continued in his position for another decade, using his reputation as the man who had solved the Ravenshollow murders to advance his political career. The neighboring planters who had helped cover up the evidence were praised for their discretion and continued to operate their own plantations without interference until the Civil War finally ended their reign of terror. The real legacy of Ravenshollow Plantation isn't just the individual crimes that occurred there, but what those crimes reveal about the moral bankruptcy of an entire society that chose to look the other way rather than confront uncomfortable truths about its own foundations. I want you to picture this: a system so thoroughly corrupt that it could transform systematic rape into Christian marriage, murder into medical research, and resistance into terrorism, all while maintaining the fiction that it was upholding civilization and moral order. The breeding program that Blackwood pioneered didn't die with him. It evolved and spread throughout the South, becoming so normalized that by the 1850s, similar operations were documented in every slave state. The methods he developed for breaking psychological resistance were adopted not just by other planters, but by prison systems, military units, and even residential schools designed to civilize Native American children. The conspiracy of silence that protected his network became the template for how American society would handle systematic violence against vulnerable populations for generations to come. Deny, deflect, and destroy the evidence while attacking anyone who dared to speak the truth. Delphine Marigny's story forces us to confront a moral question that American society still hasn't answered. When legal systems fail to protect the innocent and actually enable systematic violence, What obligations do victims have to work within those systems? When the very people charged with upholding justice are the ones perpetrating crimes, when churches bless evil and governments profit from suffering, when an entire society agrees to pretend that monsters are pillars of the community. At what point does resistance become not just justified, but morally required? The fire that consumed Ravenshollow wasn't just about one woman's revenge. It was about the price that societies pay when they choose complicity over courage, comfort over justice, and convenient lies over difficult truths. So here's what I want you to ask yourself as you're lying awake tonight. Could something like this happen today? Would we even see it coming? Because the same systems that protected Blackwood's operation, the willful blindness of authorities, the complicity of institutions, the conspiracy of silence among those who benefit from the status quo, those systems didn't disappear with slavery. They adapted, evolved, and found new ways to operate in plain sight while society collectively agrees to look the other way. The techniques that Blackwood and his network developed for breaking human resistance, for industrializing sexual violence, for maintaining plausible deniability while committing systematic crimes. You can find echoes of those methods in modern trafficking networks, in institutional abuse scandals, in any situation where power protects itself by sacrificing the vulnerable. Delphine Marigny died believing that her sacrifice would expose the truth and prevent future victims from suffering as she had suffered, but the evidence suggests that her killers learned more from her methods than her accusers learned from her testimony. If this story has affected you the way it should have, hit that subscribe button and share this video with someone who needs to understand that the difference between civilization and barbarism isn't as clear as we'd like to believe. Comment below and tell me, what would you have done in Delphine's situation? How far would you go to stop systematic evil when every legal avenue has been corrupted and every institution has been compromised? Because next week, we're investigating another case where the monsters wore badges instead of wedding rings, and the victims discovered that sometimes the only justice available is the justice you take for yourself. The screams from that story still echo through the mountains of Colorado, and once you are them, you'll understand that the real horror isn't what people are capable of doing to each other. It's how easily the rest of us learn to live with the sound of screaming.